Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I was musing today on the art and science, and I use both of those words advisedly, of building really resilient happiness. And unfortunately, a lot of us are living with first world problems, or in some cases, champagne problems, and it can be really confusing where we can be really glad that we have secure access to food and shelter and enough money, maybe not as much as we would wish for, but still feel sad and disconnected and lonely and frustrated and all of these kinds of things. And I just want to note the kind of humans are wacky creatures. So we take this human animal that's designed in a really particular way with this really epic brain, but it's a brain that has all these different parts kind of stuffed together, and some of them are much older, and all of them were originally adapted for a completely different environment. And then we take this eternal aspect of ourselves, this soul and essence, and we stuff it into this human animal container, and then we run around the world and have a lot of rich and varied experiences in this situation that involves putting on the veils of separation. So we forget our eternal nature to some degree. We get glimpses of it with practice. We can feel it more often, but there's also a lot of things that are really important about believing the story of being finite and anchored in space and time. And then we run around the world and try to have certain experiences with all these different parts of us having different agendas for what would work for us. So I talk about it in another podcast about using all of your chakras for your best life. It's darn useful to understand the agendas of each chakra, because they kind of want to stay in their lane, and the degree to which we're able to pull a benevolent, wise person to the surface of our own deepest wisdom and mediate squabbles between chakras, I think the more successful we can be. But a lot of people end up at war with themselves. So the heart chakra just wants connect, connect, connect. The root chakra just wants safety, safety, safety. And really working out the both and, never mind the other 5 chakras, can be a little bit tricksy, especially if there's something that is talking to us very loudly. So I would argue that the nature of being present in our human experience involves a lot of voices inside of us, a lot of different aspects that all have different agendas and different experiences. There's a really rich, multifaceted nature that I think we can sort of lose track of. I was looking back over previous podcasts, and one of the ones that I was remembering that I created was called something about an emotional set point. And it's this experience, sometimes it's a multi-lifetime where people have past lives where they felt the same thing over and over again. But in this lifetime too, people can really create a situation where they have sort of a narrow range of the full scope of expression and experience and flavors of life, and they just tend to dwell there. And, there's some people who just through skill or natural talent seem to have their emotional set point be toward a sunny nature side of things. And I think that's a lovely kind of thing. But this human biology that we have on average makes us 2.5 times more likely to think a scary or stressful thought than a life-affirming one. So lots of people totally get the hey, the amount of rumination I'm doing isn't helpful. I'm feeling uncomfortable things about past events, and I'm worried about the future, and I'm not here in the moment. But the tricksiness of fixing that is something that has some complexity to it. And so when we start looking at people's emotional set points, very often it's a low-level depression or low-level anger or helplessness or frustration. There's something that we kind of stew in. And in this really weird, wacky way, we can almost use the familiar low-level negative emotion to avoid transitory, high-level, more intense emotions that are trying to move through. So, for example, one of the things I really keep my finger on the pulse of is if I'm feeling grief, because I don't like grief. And I get along with grief a lot better now than I did, in my younger years. But I still know that I could numb grief without realizing it, and then things start to get wacky. I start to lose my passion for life. I start to feel, grumpy and disconnected, and I have these kind of other low-level experiences. And a lot of times there's an acute emotion that we're not allowing to have the full experience and move to the other side. And I want to note that this wisdom of, moving to the other side and letting emotions move through is somewhat particular to people who don't have some different chemistry that's happening, because that can be ill-advised for people sometimes if they're, trying to navigate the complexities of a bipolar kind of experience or something along those lines. But when we start thinking about how we stack up happiness, I think one of the things to pay attention to that is really, really helpful is we tend toward, when we're feeling a deficit of happiness, love of life, things are really working out, we really have a longing to move from either a high level of discomfort, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but something that's somewhat acute as far as the emotion that we really, really want to get out of, or that kind of low-level, uncomfortable emotional set point that can be a place that we kind of reside, a little bit of boredom, a little bit of ennui, a little bit of crankiness, whatever your particular place is that's like the low spot in an old mattress that you kind of roll into if you're not engaging a little bit differently. Total side note, one of the reasons I really love my cold plunge, even though I say bad words almost every time for the first 15 to 20 seconds, is that it really does cut through that kind of emotional set point when I get into sort of a little bit of a bad mood or brain fog that I can't shake. So it's really great to have your list of interventions. I'm not saying that dunking oneself in cold water is for everyone, but the kind of list of things that are really good interrupts when you're in a calm space, in a centered space, and having them be things that are highly attainable is very useful. So the how do I bounce myself out of that low spot in the bed, the emotional set point, that's something that's attainable, that's easy. I mean, it could be a minute of push-ups on the counter, or it could be, a minute of breath work. It's great to have a list so that you have options, because when we're feeling a little tired and grumpy, we can find reflections in an overtired toddler who does not want to go to bed or does not want to transition from whatever they're doing to dinner. And, even the very small intervention can create a lot of stubborn, I don't want to, you can't make me. And, as adults, there's nobody else to make us. We gotta create the self-efficacy of making ourselves do things. So the more efficacy, very, very effective, and attainability are some really useful things to look for in that emotional low point kind of thing. But one of the things I was musing on as I think about this Gregorian knot of, happiness in the modern era, I love the modern era. I'm so in favor of having indoor sleeping without bed bugs and temperature that I can control, and transportation where I can be on so many different power sites in a single lifetime and not have to ever have riding in a stagecoach or, spending 6 weeks on a ship that could sink in the ocean, being part of what unlocks the ability to go to Iceland, for example. So I'm not against the modern era. Some people, I think, can end up really, liking the idea of a simpler life. I grew up on a farm, and I joke that I come by my dislike of manual labor honestly, and I don't have any longing to go back to that rhythm and that lifestyle. And, if that's your jam, I think that's wonderful. I'm very much about wanting to have a smartphone and Netflix and be in the modern world, but also be able to hack and deal with my biology efficiently enough to be very happy in an environment that can create a lot of unhappiness through the system that we're in. And I want to be clear, this isn't like, some dire conspiracy of people. I think as souls, we're just, co-creating really cool technology that does really cool things. And some of the side effects of that are things that were not necessarily anticipated. And those things really speak to the depth to which we understand the human animal in which our soul is residing in order to work with it appropriately. And a good analogy here is if you think about someone who really understands dogs, adores dogs, has compassion for dogs, but also is like, hey, I know how doggy brains work. Here's how I set up a dog that is curious and engaged and happy and having quality of life, but not, knocking toddlers down or biting the mailman or yapping its head off for hours and hours. This kind of, it's not that it's a bad dog. I do think that there's some dogs that their brains are just neurotic, and that is kind of an exception. But for most dogs, there's like, if you create the right system for them, they can really thrive. And I would argue that when we're dealing with our human animal, the more that we understand it and work with it appropriately so that it can chillax and stop, being hypervigilant for the thing that could hurt us next, we can unlock a much better quality of life. So one of the perfect storms of a downward spiral on our happiness has to do with the way our instincts and capitalism end up engaging. And there's some society aspects in this. And to be clear, I'm not anti-capitalism. I do think capitalism, much like our instincts, needs a bit of adult supervision. But I'm very aware of wanting capitalism as it shows up in my life to be in service to unlocking the experience I want to have and not something that's running the show or jerking me around. And I feel exactly the same about my instincts. And there's a little bit of trickiness to that because of the nature of these things. And it's no surprise that most of the advertising is really trying to push the buttons of human animal for threat or opportunity in a way that persuades us to spend money. So advertisement, deeply, deeply understands the needs and desires of human animal. And I'm suggesting that as modern humans, we should onboard a good, solid layperson understanding of this aspect. So my experience of modern technological societies, we could talk about them as first world countries, is that there's an aspect where you're not dealing with a group of people who learn to deal with their emotions particularly well. And I'm not going to try to speak to like, this group of people does so much better. I'm quite confident that there are groups of people that do better. But our modern society has sort of moved us away from some of the better skills that we might need for relating to people. I've, over the years in the metaphysical community, heard people wax poetic about intentional communities where people are coming together and working on growing their own food. And while those can be really beautiful, and there are certainly some mature versions of it, the sort of idyllic view of it really erodes a lot of the complexity. I was on a tour at one point of one of these intentional communities, and one of the women who lived in an intentional community, they were having a very astute conversation about where are the tensions that arise in this, because it's a lot harder if you're sharing communal space and co-creating experience and making collaborative, consensus-based decisions. There's a lot of skill that goes into that, and a lot of modern people, especially in these developed nations, have really gotten far away from that skill set. So we don't always communicate as well as we could, and a lot of times we're not adept and skillful with our emotions, and we come by this honestly. We grow up in, school systems that teach us emotional suppression. They really want you to like sit in the chair and pay attention in math class. And family of origin, our parents didn't necessarily get any better, emotional tools. In a lot of cases, they were worse. And when we start to look at happiness, one of the things that I think is difficult about happiness, and happiness is kind of an interesting thing. We love the happily ever after thing, but I cracked up. I was listening to a podcast, and this particular researcher said happily ever after only happens if you die 3 minutes later. So these instances of genuine happiness and this overall well-being and contentment with all the emotions moving through, I think, is a more realistic picture. And some of these, I mentioned people who just kind of naturally have a sunny nature, and there are certainly those people, but a lot less of those people, I think, than we are led to believe because of how much our culture, people are starting to talk about toxic positivity, and there's this idea of putting on everything's great kind of front to the rest of the world, and the complexities of the highs and lows and such. But if we have this sort of baseline of happiness and well-being and alignment that is kind of structurally sound, I'm going to say, my inner engineer is peeking through, there's a lot of opportunity for things to go well for us. So why did I talk so much about emotional numbing and us not being good at emotions? Well, the reason for that is if we're sitting on emotions and suppressing them and ignoring that we're afraid or angry or feeling helpless or a lot of grief, then that doesn't really have the chance to move through. Instead of it moving through our emotional matrix, a lot of times traditions like to talk about like clouds in the sky, it rises and falls, be the witness of your emotions. But a lot of times we don't do that. We distract, and goodness knows there is so much money to be had in people paying for distraction in all of these different ways. There is so much money to be made on giving a person something that's going to produce a hit of dopamine or serotonin or these kind of happy chemicals in a really transitory way and in a not very solid way. It's in the processed food that we have. It's in the social media. There's just so much money in this. We even get these kind of happy chemicals released by like buying something online. So the solution in my mind isn't necessarily to adopt a monastic lifestyle and try to disengage from all of these chemistry hits, but we crave them a lot more when we're numbing our emotions, because what we're trying to do with something where we're trying to get happiness is a chemical response that has to be so much bigger in order to register, because we need it to get over the sort of way that we like have our emotional matrix stuck. If you think about like a singing bowl that you strike and it plays a particular note, our emotional matrix could be like someone holding their hand against the side of the singing bowl. So even if you strike it's really hard. You can get a little bit of a tone, but it's sort of damped out. And this emotional debt and this bogging down of our emotional matrix can mean that we're seeking not only these chemistry hits, but these really acute chemistry hits. And I think that that's part of what can really create this miswanting in people, where there's this deep, profound longing for something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's bad, but you might find you long for the car or the house or the promotion or the job or the vacation or the money. There are these things, and it can be really genuine, close to the heart things, people longing for a child or a romantic relationship. But there can be this sort of fixation where we end up being relentlessly focused on the thing we don't have and sort of disengaged from everything else. And there's this imagining that if we had it, it would really spike the happiness level up past this emotional numbing. So we need things that are really big and dramatic. And the trouble with that is it's just not very sustainable to have these really big hits of emotional experience, even if they're really positive. We don't want to, constantly be riding the roller coaster and, activating so much chemistry that we can go through a lot of money. We can put a lot of wear and tear on our bodies. We can participate in really, unsustainable things. We can pick partners that have a lot of high highs and low lows. There's a lot of trouble that we get into when we're like, I want the chemistry to really go through the roof. And so many different ways to do this. We could think about cocaine, but most people are using, subtler things. And, it's a catch-22 because when we hit a hard chemistry hit, and I'm talking about some external things like, if we eat sugar or we do, the online buying or the gambling highs or doing drugs. But there's also internal, we can wind ourselves up with fantasizing about something or engaging with something. The guys were reminding me of a not as attractive moment in my life. I turned 16 and I decided that I would like to have a puppy. I wanted a puppy. My parents were not particularly into a puppy. It was during Desert Storm. My dad was in the Marine Corps and he got called up. My mom was back in school, so she was under a lot of stress of being out in the world. My sister was having a lot of her own complexity. And so in retrospect, it was a rather psychologically cruel time for me to hammer relentlessly on my mother and just be so unsatisfied with anything she could possibly give me for my birthday that wasn't a puppy. But we ended up, of course, I wore her down and ended up with a puppy. And I was very happy with the puppy. And it was a golden retriever who turned out to be kind of among the most epic golden retrievers. My family has tended to do golden retrievers. And so it all worked out in the long run and such. But it was just interesting that I kind of engaged in this, there's nothing in my life that could possibly make me happy instead of a puppy. And I have compassion for my very dramatic 16-year-old as well as everyone who had to deal with her. But when we start thinking about happiness, when we're trying for something that is this really big happy that's going to move us from something where we're depressed or in struggle or having a hard time into something epic, if that's easily available, that's great, but a lot of it is not that sustainable. Like, I am so happy in Iceland. I love being in Iceland. Now, granted, I think that this is a spring, summer, fall experience of Iceland and the kind of narrow of spring and fall. It's not the, winter when the sun never comes up and the wind is whipping and you're in the dark experience of Iceland. I don't know how that would be for me, but it's amazing. But I live in San Diego, so it's a very long plane ride, and Iceland is a very expensive country to visit. So on an average Tuesday, spiking my happiness up with going to Iceland is not a particularly attainable sort of approach. So what I'd like to offer in this, having spent all this time laying groundwork for getting to the point that I'm getting to, is before we try to address happiness, the thing that can be really useful is to address emotional numbing and the fight or flight response. So if you're really paying close attention, good for you. You remember I mentioned the thing where we're 2.5 times more likely to think a scary, stressful thought than a happy, life-affirming one. And that's just kind of the average. So once our fight or flight is activated, the amount of scary, stressful thoughts and the sort of mental, machinations of terrifying pictures, really, really get escalated. And when we tune out our, wow, I'm not feeling that safe in the world because it just seems to be on all the time. And I talk about this a lot in my podcast on anxiety and working with it with shamanism. And if you listen to a lot of my work, that theme runs through as one of the best things we can do for ourselves is drop our fight or flight baseline. But when we have emotions we don't want to feel, when our fight or flight is activated and we don't want to feel that, and we start numbing out, there are all of these equivalent of, highly processed sugar snacks, things that we can do in the world, that there's so much money in selling to us. So many different flavors of numbing, but then they have that price tag on the other side that erode our financial well-being and even kind of our happiness regulation. Oftentimes our health, there's just a lot of downsides to the attempts to climb the happiness ladder from a low point all the way up to the top. But if we give ourselves a chance where we, have this experience where there's sort of availability in our emotional matrix. It's not all gummed up. There's a spaciousness. We're not stuck in being a one-trick pony in terms of our emotionality. And our fight or flight is calm. There's a sensitivity. And you could think of this with the palate. Like if you're eating a lot of highly processed sugar, you're just not going to have the sophistication for sweetness where a blueberry might taste amazing, even if it's a wonderful, perfectly ripe blueberry. So it's similar with happiness when we're going off of all these sort of artificial, often sold to us highs, then we can get really removed from the subtle things like, oh, this dog just came up to me wagging its tail and I get to pet the dog and have this, sublime moment. Or, oh, wow, I opened the windows and it's finally cooled down and the weather is lovely. Or this is a beautiful sunset. Or what a sweet moment. Somebody just said the kindest thing to me. These kind of subtle things that we can end up not really registering or having go in. And when it comes to happiness, I think it's really worthwhile to diversify, to have it be about different ways that we spend our time, different connections, different experiences. A lot of times I think people get fixated on kind of a narrow thing with happiness. So there's, a lot of intention and desire around a particular experience. It could be romantic relationship. It could be becoming a parent. It could be achieving a certain level at work. And one of the really epically cool things about my life is doing the work I've done. I'm 25 years into being a shamanic practitioner. I hear people's stories. I hear their highs and their lows and what's working and what isn't. So I get to talk to people who've been highly successful in these areas that they really yearned for. And I'm not saying it's not a great thing. I'm not saying that, it isn't good for someone who longs for a relationship to have that opportunity. But I can certainly, when it comes to addictive tendencies, and I would argue that our society is organized in a way that tends to bring out addictive tendencies. So if somebody isn't all that addictive, capitalism will try to sell them something to make them more addictive. And there'll be all of these opportunities where, the level can be, so much increased because of the accessibility of picking up your phone and looking at something that's designed to activate emotions and help you feel different without really allowing whatever was there before to move through. And I can really find that in some of the ways that I was in my 20s and 30s. Being 50 now, I'm really enjoying it, feeling different. But I really, really, really love the chemistry of romantic relationship when, a number of the chakras started to line up, when there was that affinity and sexuality and heart connection, and I felt chosen and wanted by the person I was choosing and wanting. And it had me, kind of being a little bit nutsy about things that could have, worked a little bit better, the amount of pressure and intensity when someone would come into my life and genuinely like me. And then I would be like, more, this is my favorite fix. It was, set up to be not very sustainable. And I think it's worth sort of thinking about that. It's not to say don't pursue the things that you genuinely feel like you would enjoy having, but that diversification of happiness and satisfaction in your life, so that if that piece didn't materialize or got pulled away, you wouldn't be, like like I was at 16, being like, I refuse to be happy with anything else because it isn't the puppy that I want. It was a very distinct time. I didn't stay in it that long, but all these years later, with the help of the guides, I can remember that just kind of throwing myself against, the structure of my family, but also the sort of universe of like, no, I have to have it, this one particular thing. And I genuinely love the puppy. It wasn't like I, didn't stay engaged with the dog all the time that I was at home, but it wasn't the only thing that made me happy. And we have this hedonistic adaptation where we sort of get used to things. So the pinnacle of achieving the thing can have some really high highs, but then it can be this other experience. And then there's a next experience and a next experience. So I just want to kind of note, if you're feeling like there's a lack of happiness, paying attention to calming the fight or flight and dealing with any kind of really stuck emotions and getting them to move through can be really helpful. And then you can sort of have that attunement where you start to tune into little moments of very attainable happiness and sort of stacking them together. So one of the things that is really rich in my life is getting to meet my friend for lunch every week. We have a long-standing Monday lunch date where, it's a time where we're going to get to be really present with each other amid our busy lives and talk and check in and talk shop and, have this experience. And we have a restaurant that works for us really, really well. And it's a really wonderful, really sustainable kind of thing that is a piece, a block of the happiness in my life. And my hot tub and cold plunge are also part of that. And having a bed that I really like that's super comfortable with wonderful sheets on it, and a bedroom that, is very quiet is in there. And the relationship that I have to my parents. And there's this whole stack of things that create happiness. And I really enjoy when happiness rises into that more euphoric kind of state. I went to Yellowstone and stayed inside the park, and I was going out to these places I really wanted to see, and just having the experience and just feeling so elated and joyful about the experience that I was having on the land, and the weather cooperated in kind of wacky ways. Like there was a, point where, the winds came up and the rain was coming down, but I have really good gear. So I'm like, I'm still going to go walk around the thing, but I got to have it without all the crowds of other people having experiences. So I got this much more direct experience with a very busy spot inside of Yellowstone. And I really enjoyed the I feel really happy. And I think that's great. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't weave those experiences into our lives, but I think it's worth looking at that the register of genuine, authentic happiness doesn't really stand a chance if we're distracting and numbing and participating in a lot of things that help us to numb out and help us to get these kind of artificial highs in a way. And, we can look around, it's different for, all different people, but I feel like most of us can find that inside of ourselves, that there's something that we're leaning on or using or engaging with to try to feel different more than we know is good for us. And I think that can be where some of the intensity of judgment for people who are more extreme mirrors of that. So the people who have severe alcoholism or drug addictions or gambling addictions, there's a lot of judgment that happens. And I think that really speaks to how much, we see another part of ourselves in the mirror where we, might go do something else. I was in a business training and they were talking about hitting a wall of something you didn't know how to do and having that be go to Facebook time, and then next thing you know, you're scrolling on Facebook instead of using this precious window of time toward building the business that you are really passionate about and really want to create. And to be clear, I'm not knocking Facebook or Netflix or going to the racetrack if that's your jam, or having an occasional glass of wine, or any of this. I'm not about those kind of extremes. It's just that overall, if we tune in to calming the fight or flight and onboarding some learnable skills about reckoning with our emotionality, and we remember to use them at regular intervals so that we're not trying to numb and avoid, and we don't have that whole system gummed up, there's a lot of activations of happiness, and there are a lot of pieces that we can really appreciate the well-being and how, our life is really working for us in some ways. Because I think there are a lot of cases where people can look around at their life and say, wow, things are really, really good on so many levels, and I'm really not authentically having an experience of happiness. And I certainly have, kind of reckoned with that in some ways. I've never gotten to the there's no problems, there's nothing on my mind. But at the same time, I absolutely love the work that I get to do for a living, and kind of that everywhere you go, there you are. I still have a brain that can be 2.5 times more likely to think a scary, stressful thought if I don't give it adult supervision. And there's, all of the kind of highs and lows of being human. And I think it's just complicated. It's a weird, wacky, complicated thing. And we're in a weird, wacky, complicated society. And we're not super good with dealing with this whole emotional landscape. And that can really bring us out of relationship for having a resting place of contentment and well-being and happiness and feeling that things are right in the world. And I think it's worth cultivating that as kind of the resting place in between those clouds and those emotions that move through, and paying attention to some of these complicated, interconnected things, I believe really opens up a pathway for that. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.